Hi there, I'm Scott from ByTheBrush Miniatures, and today I'm going to talk to you about thinning your paint. So first I just want to talk about why you should thin your paint. Now, I've got two examples here. This model, you can see, has not really got quite a lot of detail. You can see that all the details have been clogged up by thick paint. That's because none of the paint has been thinned down when this model was painted many years ago. So you can see lots of the details clogged, and it's very hard to make out what's what. And there's really not a whole lot of nicer details that you can really see on the model. Now on the other hand, when you look at this model, you can see all the details are nice and smooth, and everything is easy to pick out. You can tell what everything is, and everything looks separate from each other. You can see there's the face, there's the skull, there's the screen from the silver sort of chassis of the computer that it's on, and everything's just nice and smooth, and that's the reason that you should thin your paints when you're painting. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is how you should thin your paint, and that depends on two factors. The first factor is the type of paint you're using. If you're using a particularly thick paint, like a lot of Games Workshop's base paints, you're going to want to thin it down a little bit more so you can get a nice smooth coat. For this video we're going to assume you're not using a wet palette, but if you are using a wet palette, the technique should be just the same. Just draw the water from the palette itself rather than from a separate pot. So if you're using a thicker paint like this corn red here, the consistency we're going to try and get is a little bit like this. You're sort of looking for a melted ice cream type consistency, a bit like that. Now to test whether or not your paint is too thick or too thin, it's got to just do a few strokes on the palette, and that's going to show you how the paint's going to draw from the brush. So you can see if we apply it to this miniature here, Brother Rouse, you can see even when we paint over the detail, you can see all the detail is still visible. You can see a clear crack there, and none of the paint is going in between and clogging up the detail. Bear in mind, because you're thinning your paints down, it is going to take 2 thin coats, but it's worth it in the end because you're going to have a nice detailed miniature where all the details are easy to pick out. The next type of paint we're going to discuss is a thinner paint. Now with a thinner paint you need to water it down a lot less, if at all. Some paints will be so thin that you just don't need to thin them one bit. Other paints will just need a little bit of water just so that they can get that flow off the brush a little bit nicer. You can see here with this Troll Slayer Orange, it's much easier to get the melted ice cream consistency with just the tiniest touch of water, even brushing it off as I've drawn it from that pot. And there you can see the paint is not got a whole lot of pigment in it, but it's just the right consistency that we'd want to apply this to the model. So you can see there it's very thin, so if you were using this as a base coat you are going to have to use a lot of coats, but I wouldn't recommend using a paint this thin as a base coat anyway. This is more for highlighting and other things, which I'll discuss later in the video. The next type of paint I'm going to discuss is dry paint. Dry paints you don't need to water down at all because they're used for dry brushing, so we're going to discuss dry paint in a separate video. Similarly with a wash, you're not going to water them down at all, but if you do want to get rid of some of the pigment, you can use a medium such as Lamian medium to sort of tone it down a little bit. So you can do say 1 part Lamian medium and 1 part Nuln Oil. That'll make it sort of half the amount of pigment that is there, and it's going to be a much less harsh wash if you don't want to get as much definition as the wash you're using would give. Now for an example here, we've got some Nuln Oil mixed with some Lamian medium here and some pure Nuln Oil here. So just going to grab the pure Nuln Oil, show you what that looks like on a miniature. So you can see there it goes into the crevice, and it's a very deep look, so it looks like that crevice is very deep. Just going to wipe that off with tissue now so I can show you what the half and half mixture does. You can see with the half and half mixture the effect is much smaller, so that can create a sort of different effect. Say if you're highlighting something like the head, just sort of washing a section where a lot more light is going to be hitting the model in a natural setting. So that's what that's useful for. And the reason you're using Lamian medium or any other medium of your choice other than water is because water is just going to thin the wash down, so it's a bit too runny and it's not really going to do its job properly. Lamian medium is just going to tone the pigment down if that's what you're after. The next type of paint I want to talk about is contrast paint. First we're going to just address the fact that I don't believe you should water down contrast paint at all. You do again have the option of using a medium. This time I would recommend using contrast medium rather than Lamian medium, just because it's designed specifically for this, but obviously you can use your medium of choice. That's if you want less of a pigment, a lighter tone maybe, but I don't recommend watering down contrast paint. However, a lot of contrast paints are much darker than other ones, such as Black Templar for example, so I'll just show you what watering it down with some contrast medium looks like in comparison to pure black Templar. So as you can see, the pure black Templar there has given a much stronger tone overall than the black Templar that's been mixed with the contrast medium. It's more of a dark grey, that one there. So that is something that you can do. Now I'm going to talk about specific techniques, and it is going to be mainly just telling you the different sort of amounts that you need to be adding to your paint for these specific techniques. Now with base coating, you're really just looking to get an overall colour blocked in, and for that you kind of want to just make sure that you are not blocking any details. So you don't want this clumpy paint that you see in this model here. You want to get something a lot more smooth like this. So you are going to want to water it down just to about melted ice cream consistency and then apply it in 2 thin coats. Now for edge highlighting, you're going to want to water it down by quite a lot. Not so much so that it's going to just run off your brush uncontrollably into all the recesses, because that's the opposite of what you want to do. You just want to water it down by quite a lot, because it's actually going to make the paint easier to run off the brush. And you don't really want to be pressing too hard down to try and get all the paint off when you're edge highlighting, because you do want tiny bits to be left on the model. So the next technique I'm going to talk about is layering. So that's pretty much just putting another coat over the top of your base coat, but not quite going deep into the crevices where you've probably done a wash. For that, you do probably want to water your paint down a little bit more than if you're doing a base coat, unless you do really want a strong colour and you're certain about it. But it's always worth just thinning your paint down to at least make sure that you are getting a smooth coat, not any of this lumpy rubbish that you see just there. The next technique is going to be overbrushing. Now that's if you're sort of just trying to catch the very top areas. So for example, if I were to overbrush here on this area where you can see there's wrinkles in the cloak, it would just sort of get the top parts of the wrinkle. I would just gently move my brush over the top, and it's the same with, say, this Aquila. It would just get the very edges of the wing. When you're doing that, I actually recommend not watering your paint down very much at all. Just try not to use too much of it. And the reason for that is it's very similar to dry brushing technique wise, although you are using wet paint, and that is the only real difference, apart from the brush motions you're using and the outcome, obviously. And the final technique I'm going to talk about is freehanding. Now you probably want to water this down just about as much as you would if you were doing some edge highlighting, because you're doing it nice and runny so that you've got as much control over the paint as you possibly do, so you can control exactly where it's going. I would just advise against having it too runny, because obviously then it's just going to become a messy puddle. Now I hope this video was helpful, and I really hope you enjoyed. Please leave a like and subscribe. Only about 6% of you at the minute are subscribed, so we'd love to change that. We've got an open Discord you can join if you want to become a member of our community. You can put your stuff on there and we'll do a reaction video in the future to your own creations and models. We'd obviously really appreciate some support on Patreon. You can go there and just for a short fee you get a bunch of really cool benefits. You can also follow our Instagram. We've got loads of pictures of the stuff we've painted for YouTube and in our own time. And with that said, we'll see you in the next one.